Aloha, good evening everybody. Thank you so very much for welcoming us into this space. We're really excited to have this conversation with you at a moment when public safety is on the front of a lot of folks' minds. So thank you so much for coming out and being interested in this conversation. I want to start by letting you know what the goals of the conversation are tonight. First, we're going to talk about what Hawaii is getting right and wrong when it comes to public safety. Second, we're going to talk about what we can learn from other jurisdictions. And third, let's explore together a vision for accountable policing that actually makes communities safer and how we get there. We're going to be exploring these topics tonight with the two panelists to my left here. First, further left, we have Wookie Kim. Wookie is the legal director of ACLU of Hawai, where he works to defend people's civil rights and civil liberties, primarily through litigation, but also through lobbying, public education, and other forms of community advocacy. Police misconduct is one of the many issues that he is focused on here in Hawaii. He has litigated and is currently litigating several lawsuits challenging egregious rights violations by police on issues including excessive force, racial discrimination, conflicts of interest, and DUI enforcement practices. Welcome, Wookie. Our other panelist tonight is Josh Parker. Josh Parker is my colleague and Deputy Director of the Policy and Policing Project at NYU School of Law. At the Policing Project, Josh drafted and revised model statutes and policies on subjects including use of force, vehicle pursuits, officer decertification, and policing data collection. He's offered expert testimony on these issues and others in a variety of states across the country. Josh joined the Policing Project for the Appeals and Opinions Bureau of the New York State Office of the Attorney General. Before working for the Office of the Attorney General, Josh worked in the Washington, D.C. office of Jenner and Block, where he represented indigent criminal defendants and habeas petitioners before courts across the country and maintained a substantial civil rights pro bono practice. Welcome, Josh. To start the evening by getting us all on the same page. We're doing some level setting about the conversations and the topics that we'll be covering tonight. Because I find that when folks say public safety, sometimes we are not speaking the same language and that we are talking about very different things. So I'd like to ask the panelists, Wookie, starting with you, what does public safety mean to you?
Sure. Hello? Okay, I think that works. I don't have anything earth-shattering to say on this point, but really public safety is about safety from harm, and particularly from a civil rights, civil liberties perspective, it's not just about safety from other community members, it's also about safety from the state. And what that means is safety from being handcuffed and arrested as a 10-year-old girl for drawing a cartoon, like one of our clients was. Safety from being tased to death when you're having a mental health crisis, like Sheldon Halleck was just outside Iolani Palace. And of course, safety from getting shot in the face and killed after dropping off your daughter at daycare. So I think the emphasis that I'm trying to make is that the state has so much power and has the ability to inflict a lot of harm on the community. And that's a part of this question or definition of public safety that I think a lot of people maybe overlook.
Josh?
I couldn't agree more. Safety from excessive force or unreasonable police violence is a core part of public safety. I would add that public safety must be defined more broadly to also encompass things like being able to navigate in public free from unlawful discrimination and harassment, to have a real opportunity to secure safe and secure housing, and to receive prompt and quality medical care, especially when injured by another, including by law enforcement.
Thanks. Those are, I think, comprehensive answers, and I think sometimes we take a very narrow view of public safety, so I appreciate those answers. This may feel basic, but again, for the benefit of getting on the same page, I'd like to ask you both in turn, what does police accountability mean? What are we talking about here tonight? Josh, I can start with you.
Sure. When we talk about accountability, at my organization, the Policing Project, we separate it into two components. Back-end accountability and front-end accountability. I think when the community thinks of accountability, they are often rightfully thinking really, really hard about back-end accountability. That means when officers engage in egregious misconduct, criminally prosecuting them, essentially initiating decertification proceedings where their license is taken away, and bringing civil lawsuits and trying to overcome really tough barriers or reform these barriers like qualified immunity. Those are all super, super important, but just as important is front-end accountability, setting clear rules through legislation and regulation and other means that police must follow, and having clear consequences that are actually and consistently enforced when those rules are violated, right? So that this would involve passing comprehensive excessive force legislation. There was just a law passed, we'll get into later, regulating vehicle pursuits, and enforcing those laws when they're violated. That is part of accountability as well.
I think that was a great way to think about it, the kind of front end versus the back end. From my perspective, police accountability really has two parts. One is about just ensuring that there are real consequences for misconduct. And the other part of it is just to ensure that police are held to the same standard as any other government employee. We will probably talk about this at some point today, but in a lot of respects, police officers actually get treated better than or differently than other public officials.
Okay, great. And at the risk of belaboring this sort of level set conversation, I'd like to hear, maybe briefly, how you guys think police accountability actually impacts public safety and why we need it to achieve that vision of public safety that you guys articulated. Wookie, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the first point is that when there's accountability, the community is safer from harm, especially government-inflicted harm. But I think there's a second part of this that's a little bit more subtle, which is that when there's accountability, the community has trust in public institutions, of course, the police department being a major public institution, which also then increases sort of the perception of safety in the community, which is another important aspect of this puzzle.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's actually studies that show when the community perceives the police as more legitimate, crime clearance rates go up because community members have greater trust in police and are more likely to cooperate. There isn't accountability, there isn't trust in police, there's great discrimination and racial disparities that actually it makes the police less likely to resolve crimes and solve crimes, especially violent crimes.
You used the term crime clearance, and I'm not familiar with that term. Can you explain that?
Sure. Crime clearance simply means the idea that someone calls and says there was a robbery or there was a murder, the ability to find who perpetrated the crime and arrest them.
Thanks. As long as we're trying to clear things up, I appreciate the question. Okay, hopefully we're more or less on the same page now. So I'd like to start. Wookie, can you tell us, where are we now? What do you view as the most pressing problems in policing? And that might be at Honolulu Police Department or other county agencies across the state. What's top of mind for you?
We could be here all night discussing this question. I decided to prioritize 3 of many pressing problems. I think in line with what I was just saying, the first major problem is a lack of consequences for police officers who commit misconduct. The disciplinary system, and I'm speaking primarily about my experience dealing with Honolulu Police Department, but I don't think the neighbor island police departments are an exception on this point. But the disciplinary process is absolutely broken. And we'll talk about this later, but the collective bargaining agreement endows police officers with protections that if you all realized would shock you. And so let me give you an example. If you are a police officer and you're accused of any kind of misconduct, you have certain rights when it comes to interrogations of you. Among those rights, you are entitled to a reasonable time and location for the interrogation. You're not allowed to be questioned continuously for more than 30 minutes. You're entitled to reasonable rest breaks. You're entitled to a transcript of your interrogation after the fact. You're not allowed to be told lies. Yet, when police are interrogating criminal defendants every single day, they're coercing, using manipulative tactics, they're trying to exhaust the criminal defendants by holding marathon interrogation sessions. But sorry, it's a little bit of a sidetrack here. The point is that additional disciplinary process is not working. Even when it does succeed, there's an arbitration process that's created through the collective bargaining agreement, under which a lot of people who are doing really dangerous, harmful things are being reinstated. And the best example is one police officer who's probably been in the news a lot. I don't want to use names. Several years ago was caught on surveillance camera beating his then girlfriend. The police department conducted an investigation, fired him, but then went through the arbitration process, and through this secretive process, the arbitrator said, actually what happened was just a, quote, playful sparring match. This officer then got reinstated with full back pay and benefits, and is, was on the police force until actually he retired just this year, last fall. This is the system that we have. It's one that has very few consequences for misconduct. The second piece is a lack of transparency in how policing is done. There are many officers who are able to hide in the shadows or do things in the shadows. An example of this is the crime reduction unit here with HPD. These are plainclothes officers who don't wear body-worn camera. And there have been several high-profile incidents of crew officers brutalizing people, and that is extremely problematic. And of course, everyone knows about, hopefully, the ACLU-HI scandal, the mailbox conspiracy. That also was perpetrated initially by the crime reduction unit, which was secretively doing the bidding of Chief ACLU-HI to frame a family member in a personal dispute. And the last point I'll make, a follow-on point, but in general, there's a culture that tolerates this, right? Bad officers and bad police practices. The prime example of this is the Makaha police chase and crash, where officers tailed a car, crashed into it, caused the car to crash, severely injuring all of the driver and all of the occupants, and then left the scene and pretended like they had just heard about the crash and decided to report to the scene of the crash. Of course, these officers are being prosecuted right now. But were it not for surveillance footage at a gas station, the public, none of us would have known that these officers had tried to cover up their misconduct. And that's why transparency is so important. And of course, the final point is that we have a system that's rife with disparities, whether it's racial disparities, people with mental disabilities, people who are houseless. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and I know that there's a lot more to say on this point. And I also don't want to minimize any of what Wookie just said by the question I'm going to ask, but a lot of folks in this room, in the community here, are dialed into these problems and have been trying to make progress. And so I think a full picture of where we are right now does need to include what's been done recently to try and alleviate some of the many, many problems that Wookie talked about. So Josh, can you tell us about some recent improvements in policing that have happened here in Hawaii?
Sure, and I'm going to focus on some state legislation that has passed on the policing reform in the past few years.
Are you speaking to the microphone?
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about some state legislation. You know, what we see in almost every state except Hawaii right now is that there are different levels of discipline. There is this agency who could hire and fire the officer, but there's often restrictions like arbitration and collective bargaining provisions like Wookie talked about. But then you have a state licensing agency. In other states, it's called a post board, Peace Officer Standards and Trainings Board. In Hawaii, it's called a Law Enforcement Standards Board, LESB, that has authority to license officers, just like teachers are licensed, just like nurses are licensed, just like lawyers are licensed, just like lawyers can be disbarred across the state for serious misconduct. In all those other states, police officers can be basically disbarred, have their license revoked for serious misconduct. 2018, the Hawaii legislature passed a law empowering the LESB to do just that, certify officers and revoke their licenses. But the legislature took a long time to fund the LESB. They were not even empowered to hire a full-time staff member until like 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. Now there's a bill to get them a little more funding. They're currently drafting their decertification and licensing rules and regulations. That can be, it's not there yet, but that can be a really important means of holding police accountable statewide by stripping their license if they engage in serious misconduct. I'll talk about one other reform that passed just this past session. One of the issues Wookie talked about was basically a pursuit where police rammed into another vehicle. There was a bill last session, it's now called Act 210, that greatly restricted law enforcement's ability to engage in high-speed pursuits, especially for low-level offenses. Now there are 8 or 9 statutorily set serious offenses that law enforcement can chase for, but only if there are no other means of reasonably apprehending the suspect. No longer, once this law takes full effect, can law enforcement chase for minor violations like having a broken taillight or having a registration that just expired. Passing legislation is only part of the picture, of course. We'll talk about more how, enforcement matters and consistent application matters, but those are real accomplishments that deserve praise.
Thanks. Okay. I think we said it in the intros, but Josh and I work at a national police reform nonprofit. And so while we are lucky to partner with folks on the ground here in Hawaii, we also work in other states. And so, Josh, I'd like to ask, in other states of the U.S., what policies have you seen enacted that have actually increased accountability and improved public safety in that sort of expansive sense that we talked about earlier?
So I'm going to talk about 2 issues here. These are areas where many other states in the country have passed reforms in the past few years, and Hawaii has yet to do so, but has an opportunity to do so now. The first is policing data collection and transparency. We have over 20 states in the country now that, for example, collect traffic stop and often pedestrian stop data, demographic, racial information, and about who is stopped in traffic stops, who's trapped on the sidewalk, are they searched, what is the reason for the stop, etc. And we could see from states that have been collecting this data for years the transformational nature that this data could be when it's released to the public and released to lawmakers. My organization conducted a study in Nashville, actually with the cooperation with the City of Nashville and the Nashville Police Department, to study the effect of the stop data and the effectiveness of low-level stops. Again, stops for a broken taillight, stops for rolling through a stop sign, and those sorts of low-level stops. And what we found was that there were huge racial disparities for those stops, and When they stop doing those stops for a period of time and we're focused on the more serious violations, going 30 miles per hour with the speed limit, DWI, the racial disparities reduced and crime did not go up. There's a jurisdiction in Connecticut that studied their stop data. It's called Wilmington, Connecticut. And they found when they stopping for kind of those low-level offenses, you know what went up? Stops for DWI, stops for DUI. So that's sort of just the data, even though passing these data collection transparency laws aren't directly regulating police conduct, not only are they giving the public information they're entitled to, how their law enforcement officers are behaving, but they're actually teaching law enforcement how to better further public safety by focusing on the stops that are actually serving traffic safety and public safety, rather than those that are just needlessly generating racial disparities. So that's one bucket. There's other buckets of data like use of force data on use of forces used against, and also police misconduct complaint data. What are the demographics of the people complaining? Who are the officers they're complaining about? Is it the same two officers? That sort of data is collected in other states, but not yet Hawaii. The second area I talk about where we're seeing a lot of movement in other states is citation authority or summons authority. So in almost every other state in the country, there is a presumption for low-level criminal offenses, think kind of minor shoplifting or maybe underage drinking. For those sorts of offenses, there's a presumption that instead of arresting someone, taking them to prison or jail, requiring that they post bail, and if they don't, putting them in already overcrowded jails, a lot of jurisdictions cite them instead. They give them a form that says you have to show up to court on this date, here's a number to call if you have any questions about it, and most people who get that form show up. Hawaii, by comparison, is the most expansive arrest authority in the country. For any criminal offense, Hawaii police have the authority to arrest someone so long as the arrest occurs soon after the crime occurred. And we see other states curbing that authority by saying you cannot arrest them unless, for these minor offenses, unless you have a reasonable belief that someone is posing an imminent public safety risk, a risk of bodily injury to someone else, or is not going to show up to court, or you're not able to identify them. But if those exceptions aren't satisfied, give them a citation and avoid disrupting their lives. Yes, I'll stop there.
All right, thanks for that sort of zoom out to look at what's happening across the country, but let's zoom back in. Wookie, I'd love to hear from you. What's happening in this moment that you think is progress or potential for progress? So are there practices, policies, leadership changes, community movements that are a step forward in your view?
Yeah, I think that the power is with the people and the community to advocate for change and to insist on change. And specifically, in recent years, there are various community groups that really have been fighting for transparency and accountability with policing. Whether that's the Public First Law Center, which really has spearheaded a lot of the efforts to get access to documents that all of us should have access to. That case that I mentioned with the arbitration decision, that arbitration decision was not available to the public, so Public First Law Center sued. So a judge agreed to release that file, but then the police union sued to prevent public disclosure, and this Public First Law Center got involved. But organizations like that, organizations like the Reimagine Public Safety Coalition, mobilizing and getting people to care about this very issue, and then putting aside the community, right, the media, the press corps. So there have been several investigative reporters, particularly at Hawaii News Now, who have reported on stories that have led to real impacts and changes with policing. One example is actually our pending lawsuit against HPD around its pattern and practice of falsely arresting folks for DUI without probable cause and without due process. We only learned about this issue because of the fantastic reporting that Lynn Kawano had done over several months. And then another example is Allison Blair had reported about an officer, ironically, who ran into a motorcyclist and then lied to 3 different police officers about what had happened, made 3 different stories up. But it wasn't until HNN did a story about that incident that the officer faced any sort of consequences. And then aside from community groups, of course, there's litigation pressure from organizations like ACLU of Hawai and other plaintiffs' attorneys who are just trying to ensure that people, everyday people who are being harmed by police are getting redress for those wrongful acts. And so, we have several active cases right now against different police departments. And again, as Kelly mentioned, we've litigated conflicts of interest in policing for quite a number of years. And so, I think collectively, this effort has to be pushed forward on every front, but really it's everyone in this room that needs to, participate as much as possible in public processes and policy making.
Thanks. Josh, I know you focus a lot on the policy side, the legislative side. Anything to supplement there?
Yeah, I would pick up where he left off. I talked about with, this certification, decertification of officers by the Law Enforcement Standards Board earlier. They have public meetings every month. And I've attended the past 4 or 5. They've actually had to cancel a few of them because they couldn't reach quorum. But the ones they have, we've attended, the ACLU has attended, but I think the broader community doesn't necessarily know what they're up to or know the importance of what they're up to, because I haven't seen community members at those meetings. So I would urge you to pay attention to what they're doing, because what they're doing right now is they've released draft rules for licensing officers, the background checks agencies must conduct on officers, and the grounds, the reasons that they can be stripped of their license, for example, because they use really excessive force or because they engage in unlawful discrimination. So that is one thing that's in process with the Law Enforcement Standards Board. Something else that is they're currently reviewing is that pursuits law I talked about. They were tasked with drafting a model policy that they have revised to comply with the law in response to the advocacy that Wookie's organization and we gave. But they are working currently with the different law enforcement agencies to try to get them to adhere to the law. So that is an in-progress solution. And again, I would urge the community to be paying attention to implementation with the Law Enforcement Standards Board and with your county law enforcement agencies.
All right, thanks. This is a little bit of a broad question. So we've got things that are happening, things that may move us forward. What are the barriers to actually being able to move forward, apart from maybe needing more community eyes on some of the aspects of this? Wookie, do you want to start us off with what you see as the big barriers here?
Sure. I think one of the barriers that I already mentioned is the SHOPO collective bargaining agreement. And I just want to also explain that obviously unions and union protections are incredibly important, and a lot of what is in that collective bargaining agreement is important and ensures workplace safety and whatnot. It's just that that agreement also includes provisions that are, again, giving police officers protections that no other government employee gets. And I forget if I mentioned this, but disciplinary records. Police disciplinary records are treated and kept under lock and key like gold bars at Fort Knox. There's been so much litigation around police disciplinary records over the last decade or so. And in fact, the legislature passed a law in 2019 trying to increase transparency and access to police disciplinary records. What happened? The union sued, claiming that that law was unconstitutional and violating police officers' rights. So there are pieces like that in the collective bargaining agreement that really stymie the ability to hold police accountable. A second barrier is that culture change is hard, right? Changing a policy is not going to solve the problem because, and we know this through our own litigation, that, you know, and I want to be careful about what I share about some of our pending lawsuits. But what we've learned from litigating these cases is that when we present an exhibit with an HPD policy in front of an officer, sometimes they don't even know what the policy is. They don't know the key components or directives of that policy. And we're not talking, you know, minute, arcane policies here. We're talking use of force policy, right? We're talking arrest policy. So there's a big problem that is largely in the informal spaces, right? The culture. Incentives being misaligned. There are many examples I could talk about, but I mean, I think it's just some basic ones. When police officers commit misconduct and there's a settlement in a lawsuit, who pays for that? It's not the police officer, it's not the police department, it's all of us as taxpayers, right? It comes from general funds, which creates bad incentives, meaning if police departments are not experiencing any sort of negative financial consequence when one of its officers commits serious harm, what incentive is there for leadership to ensure that practices change? So that's just a basic example. And then political cowardice. I think this is a tough one, and I know there's some people in here associated with elected officials, but the point here is that no elected official really wants to be the one to push back against police officers, right? I mean, and of course, no one wants to be perceived as soft on crime. And so, I'll stop.
I'll add to this. I'm going to add one more barrier, but before I do that, I'll say these barriers can be overcome. Like, let's talk about, like, briefly, like, the collective bargaining agreement provisions, the police union contracts that are giving police more protections than every other public employee. We have a model statute called Removing Barriers to Officer Accountability that state legislatures can pass that would say you're not allowed to include these provisions, right? Police should be getting the same disciplinary protections that teachers and nurses and firefighters get, right? Not special protections. And we've seen two jurisdictions, DC and Maryland, go even further than what's in our model statute and keep discipline totally out of collective bargaining for police and have them subject to the civil service process that many other public employees are subject to. So that's just one example of a solution there. And one other barrier I'd identify is the lack of transparency with respect to data in Hawaii is actually a real impediment to reform. So we've seen in jurisdictions across the country, I would say in the past 5 years or so, of movement to reduce low-level pretextual traffic stops and basically prohibit them unless a more serious offense was committed. So, right, if someone has one broken tail light, what I was talking about before, the registration just expired, their windshield wipers aren't quite working properly. For something like these kind of low-level offenses, what these jurisdictions say is if that's the only offense you're committing, then the police can't pull you over. Maybe they could mail you a citation, but that is not a good use of the police's time. That's what generates racial disparities. And when they do pull over, data in other states shows for those low-level offenses, they actually aren't finding guns. They're not usually finding drugs. So they're not serving kind of the purpose of the stop for the police, which is to kind of solve crime, right? And get guns off the street, illegal guns off the street. But Because this data is not published by any of Hawaii's law enforcement agencies, we can't reach conclusions. We can't reach conclusions about the extent of the racial disparities, nor can we see whether those stops are turning up evidence of crime. So that's why passing data collection reform in Hawaii is so important to overcome these really significant barriers.
Yeah, I'm gonna take off the moderator hat for a second and just try and tie up a couple things you guys said too, which is that I think the phenomenon of folks who are elected lacking political courage is very real, and that is also a barrier that can be overcome. And the thing that can inspire courage is engagement, right? And hearing from constituents that this is an issue that matters. So that is fully, well, at least partially, in the hands of folks in this room and that you're in community with. So now moderator hat is back on, and I will, actually, Wookie, Josh sort of talked a lot about how there's a lot we don't know about policing in Hawaii, and we just don't have the data. Tell me, can you dig into that a little bit? What is it that is opaque, or what are some of the things that feel the least accessible in terms of what we know about them here?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I've already mentioned, disciplinary records are held under lock and key. That also includes the employee grievance process, the arbitration decisions, all those files. I mean, we've had tremendous difficulty getting disciplinary records from officer defendants, even in situations where we've sued the city. And then to Josh's point about data, right, it's really hard to get any number of relevant police records and data, whether through public records requests or even through litigation. And even for all of you, you theoretically are supposed to have access to police reports and incidents you're involved in, body-worn camera for arrests you're involved in. But there are a lot of practical and other hurdles that are imposed. For a long time, in order to make a request for a police report or body-worn camera, you had to notarize the document that you were using to submit your request. And beyond that, right, fees are charged. Body-worn camera right now, they don't give it to you digitally, or they give it to you digitally, but they give it to you on a CD-ROM. Now, some of you may know what CD-ROMs are, but in this day and age, it's quite hard to come by a CD drive. And in our office, we only have one computer that has a CD-ROM drive. And then, of course, there's the kind of all the redactions and the time that it takes to redact out third-party information, et cetera. It's really hard to get data and records from the police department.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Josh, okay, we keep talking about this problem of transparency of data. What do we do to fix it?
Yeah, so Wookie talked about, the burden's really on community members currently to get these records. They have to file these public records requests, and even for a lawyer, that could be kind of complicated because there are exemptions in the statute that are pretty vague, and then you have to read cases and sometimes appeal denials, so kind of hard for a member of the public to do that and litigate that without legal assistance, and obviously not everyone has legal assistance. So for kind of the most fundamental policing data, some of the data we've been talking about before, use of force data, like how many people did Honolulu PD kill this year, right? And in what parts of Honolulu, or what parts of Oahu were those people killed? What were the races of those people who were killed? And were they armed, right? How old were they? What were their gender? What was their gender? That information you should not have to file a public records request for. In other states, in over a dozen other states, what the law says is that law enforcement agencies need to report that information to a state agency who affirmatively releases it to the public on a public website. And the best practice is to release what's called, this sounds technical, but I'll explain what it means, incident level data. That means not, of course they can also aggregate the data and show kind of graphs and charts, But the best practice is like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet that has every single incident in which an officer used force, and then all of the data points we just discussed. Whether there was serious injury, if so, what was the injury, was the person armed, what was the race, age, gender of the person, etc. Why is that so important? Because that incident level data then allows journalists, members of the media, lawmakers, and researchers at academic institutions like UH to conduct independent analysis of that data rather than giving law enforcement the last word. I would also say there are other best practices with respect to data collection, like having tasking like a university, institution with issuing an annual report, analyzing the data so the public can make sense of the data, and having really accessible dashboards with that data. And I will we're being very, very, very critical of law enforcement today. I'll give credit where it's due. The Attorney General's office just released a crime data dashboard. This isn't policing data. It's not the buckets of data we're talking about, but it has broad data on arrests on the different islands and what people are arrested for and how many arrests there are in a given year. And that is a really workable dashboard. So it shows that there is the potential for improvement on data collection transparency in Hawaii, but that's only the first step, and there's many more steps to go.
All right. So again, there's things we can do here. One thing that neither of you mentioned that we see a lot as something that's opaque in other places is what technology police are using, right? In a lot of places, for example, police use facial recognition, and what happens is that they buy these tools with their budget, and they are not telling anybody, and they're using these tools all over the place. So, Wookie, can you talk about technology use here in Hawaii and what we know, what we don't know, what we suspect? Is that transparent, or is that also sort of hidden from the public?
Yeah, I think transparency around what technology is being used has been a perennial problem, I think, in Hawaii when it comes to policing. But even before talking about cutting edge technology, I will note that HPD in particular has a history of being behind on transparency enhancing technology. So you may or may not know this, but HPD does not require dash cams. And actually, from my very limited quick research, it's the only major police department that doesn't require dash cams, right? You think about, you see footage in other jurisdictions, there's tons of dash cam footage. Of course, right, dash cams protect not just the people, the citizens, it also protects officers too, right? Yet HPD does not have dash cam technology. And similarly, I think it's not just HPD, but just in Hawaii in general, the counties took very long to even adopt body-worn cameras. In fact, in one of our lawsuits, the officer in the body camera footage says, "Oh shoot, our department just got body-worn cameras. I forgot to turn it on." And that was in 2019 that HPD really adopted body-worn camera technology. But as far as the cutting-edge technology, AI use, more advanced surveillance tools, including face recognition technology, little by little, the department is developing programs that rely on these tools. And you may have seen the news recently that HPD is currently piloting reliance on Draft One, which is a AI-generated police report technology. There are many, many problems with AI reliance in this context, and I think one of the things I try to emphasize is that a police report is supposed to document what an officer sees. That is not the same thing, sees and perceives. That is not the same thing as what a camera on your chest records, right? I might have a camera on my chest, and I might be facing this way, but I might be looking in the complete opposite direction. But if AI is going to generate a narrative about what you saw based on this camera, it's going to be very different from what you actually saw. And it's really important that officers are providing their own human narratives of what happened. So that's an example. And you may or may not know this, but in downtown Chinatown area, There have been a whole series of surveillance cameras that have been installed, and all of these have facial recognition technology. And protecting privacy is a whole separate issue, but and we could be here all night on that. But I'll just stop there.
Yeah, and I'll just supplement that by saying, in addition to the problems with this sort of AI-generated police report that Wookie talked about, right, that's never capturing the entire scene and certainly not the officer's perceptions, that we've also seen reports from other parts of the country where the dash cam has picked up audio from other sources, the radio, or movies that might be playing in somebody's house while an arrest is happening, and incorporates those into the report. There's one where apparently a suspect was watching The Princess and the Frog, and the police report indicates that the officer turned into a frog. So, a lot of problems with those technologies. Josh, you've given us a lot of points and time where you've called us to have some hope. So, what's the hope here? How can we better regulate this kind of tech use?
Yes, I talk about kind of two first step, solutions. Any technology or AI tool that is kind of having significant impact on the community like this, that has these kind of surveillance privacy concerns or not, like automated license plate readers, like facial recognition technology, like generative AI, should be democratically authorized, right? The city council in Hawaii, should be asking questions of Honolulu PD about them, and Honolulu PD should only be using them if the city council votes to approve them and the community agrees that, they should be using them. And ideally, the city council and, the police commission should be saying, yes, you can use them under these conditions, right? Like you can only retain the data for this long, setting privacy protections, etc. But in Hawaii right now, Honolulu PD and the other county law enforcement agencies and DLE, they're just making the decisions themselves. There really isn't any meaningful oversight at all. So that is one solution, is to require democratic authorization before these tools are used. Another really, really, really important first step right now is something we call AI disclosure, AI tool disclosure. So what's striking is it is really, really common if someone is criminally prosecuted and an AI tool was used to generate a lead or maybe discover that they committed a crime, let's say facial recognition technology was used or an automated license plate reader or Gen AI wrote the report, police usually are not writing that in the police report. So then when the case file goes to prosecutors to file charges, they have no idea that these possibly unreliable AI tools were used. And so they might just assume, okay, the officer drafted this report, the officer certainly wasn't hallucinated, even if the Gen AI included a hallucination. So we've seen last year, California and Utah both passed laws saying anytime Gen AI is used in a police report, that has to be noted in the report, has to note which sections used AI, and then that would go to prosecutors, and then when a criminal defendant is charged, that report would be disclosed to the criminal defendant, and the defendant and their public defender or their counsel can ask questions through the discovery process to get at the unreliability of that sort of technology. And now in New York, Virginia, and Minnesota, there's set to be introduced legislation that would broaden that sort, that's a little broader than the California and Utah legislation, that would say any AI tool is used, whether it's an automated license plate reader, facial recognition technology, shot spotter, Gen AI, that needs to be noted in the police report, disclosed to prosecutors, and then disclosed to criminal defendants. And also, every law enforcement agency needs to release an inventory to the public of every AI tool they're using and what they're using them for. Because even if, I was saying before, every tool should be democratically authorized by the city council, but even in the absence of that, the public at least has a right to know everything the law enforcement agencies are using and what they're using them for, and they don't currently know that.
Thanks. And since I've done such a good job up front of making sure we're all speaking the language. I'll just offer some clarification, which is that Gen AI that Josh is talking about is generative AI, or uses of AI to create something. So to write something for you, to make up a picture or a film. But there are other types of AI too, right? Like you can use this powerful machine learning to do things other than create. You can use it to scan a license, the driver's license database to pull faces out and try to match faces. So just to clarify that. All right, we've heard a lot about problems. We've heard about some solutions. There are folks like Wookie who are working in the courts every day to try and make policing better in Hawaii. There are folks like Josh and I who are working in legislatures across the country to try and do this work. But I think I'd love to leave you guys here tonight before we move on to Q&A with thoughts about what you can do. So, Wookie, let's start with you. What can folks sitting here in the room tonight do to make progress on these issues we've talked about?
I mean, I think it really comes down to participation in all of the relevant public processes that exist. That means, obviously, the state legislature, the next legislative session is about to start. But of course, county police departments are units of the counties too, and so the city council plays a role on all of this too. And to this question of democratic accountability, right? The city council often does play a role in sort of approving or endorsing certain expansions of, for example, surveillance technology. And so you going and testifying and sharing your personal story or your concerns about being surveilled or whatever it may be is so much more impactful, right? Because it's the stories, it's the emotion that really changes people's minds. So really it's that. And then of course there are other processes that people don't maybe know about, the average person isn't really paying attention to, but the Honolulu Police Commission, which has the authority to, hire and fire the police chief, but, there are a lot of other functions that commission plays, including investigating allegations of misconduct. But those are all open to the public, and it's really important, and theoretically, the members of the commission include a lot of lay people, right? And it's really important that members go in and share stories, members of the public go in and share their stories about interactions with the police. I'll share that from our organization's perspective, we get so many intakes from people who have been abused by police. And a lot of what we see is that they can't prove the harm that they experienced because the body camera wasn't turned on, or it was a crime reduction unit officer. And really what we're trying to do in recent years is to empower them to share their stories with legislators and in these public fora. Right now, there's the chief selection process for HPD, and based on other efforts by community advocates, the process is going to be a little bit more public, a little bit more inclusive, right? Application materials will now be available to the public in a way that the last hiring process did not allow. Participate in these processes.
I would completely echo that. Show up to anyone can testify. Show up to testify. We've been advocating in Hawaii for a few years now, and usually on kind of the law enforcement related bills, there is more law enforcement member testimony and law enforcement leadership testimony than community member testimony, and it does not need to be that way. I'd also say call your representatives, right? It doesn't just have to be testifying. Write a letter if you're more comfortable, not comfortable kind of speaking in public, submit written testimony, or just call them directly, go into the office. The state capitol, which I visited for the first time on this trip, is beautiful. So at the very least, you'll have a nice experience walking through it. I would also encourage folks to support kind of the media organizations and spread the word about the media organizations and kind of public interest law organizations that Wookie talked about, who are doing kind of amazing reporting and bringing these important lawsuits like the Public First Law Center, like Civil Beat, So much of, I think, the ACLU's work and other work is only possible when these organizations are actually doing the investigative journalism and reporting to uncover the misconduct in the first place. The last point I would make is I would assume many of you are associated with organizations or community groups of some kind, whether that's an organization that's a faith group or a civil rights organization or an affinity group based on your ethnicity or gender. If you are either a leader in that organization or you can talk to leadership, that can carry a lot of weight if the organization or a representative of the organization submits testimony to the legislature, publishes an op-ed, makes their positioning known on that issue, on the issue of public safety. So those would be my recommendations.
Thanks, and I'll add to that list of organizations, neighborhood boards as well. All right, well, that concludes the questions we wanted to talk about tonight. So we'd love to hear what questions you have for any of us up here. I can, maybe Mandy can hand the mic to folks. Okay, fantastic, and we would be happy to answer questions. We should have about 15 minutes before we wrap up.
Not all at once.
Hi, my name is Christina. For the last few months, I've been actually advocating, I'm standing so you can see me. So I've been advocating for a group of people that have all seen the same types of responses from HPD. And most of those responses include misclassification. And where that is they say that violent matters that happen inside people's homes, when people have their bones broken, like the gentleman that I have there for you today, are civil matters, and they refuse to investigate them or press any charges or make any arrests. I have this very thick document here with multiple people that experience the same type of situation, myself included. I recently had a situation personally where I had to get a TRO after an individual broke into my home with myself and my minor daughter present multiple times, and each time the police said it is a civil matter. So they told me to get a TRO, and when I got that TRO, I gave it to them to serve to the man. I gave it to him on December 26th. On January 1st, I got a phone call. I wasn't home. Police officers were around the back part of my house where this man had broken a window to access my home, where he had broken a door to access my home, where he had assaulted people on my property while breaking into my home. Each time they refused to arrest. Unfortunately, after that, when I got the TRO, like they said, they got a phone call from this man that he asked the officers to meet them at my house, which was protected by the TRO. The officers contacted me on the phone, and I begged them over the phone over and over, please serve the man with the TRO, and they refused to serve him with the TRO that they had in their possession. They told me that I had to come to the place where this man was, which was my home, which was protected by the TRO that they were tasked with serving, and call 911 if I wanted to talk to a supervisor. So, all of this, again, they keep telling us it's a civil matter. There's been airmates deployed in an apartment building with tenants in it. The police refused to answer the 911 calls. To this day, these people can tell you right here, if you call from that building, they will tell you 911, they're not coming. I called to report an act of robbery because, as I said, I've been advocating for these people. I called, I was at the time on crutches. I let them know, the 911 operator, no, I was on crutches. They told me if I couldn't make it to the building and meet the police outside the building within 10 minutes, they were canceling the call. When I got there, the lady whose house was being robbed was assaulted in an active crime. Like there was an active crime going on in her house being burglarized. She was assaulted. And she was assaulted after the police refused to escort her safely to her home. They told her she tried to get in herself, past the men that were robbing her, but they assaulted her, they beat her down. African-American woman, business owner, they robbed her whole business, her home, everything, and they beat her in front of the police while she's back. Everything's on video. Everything that I'm speaking about is on video and documented, and it's been reported on. But we keep hitting brick walls, and I continue to hit brick walls. I had to go to the judge with my TRO hearing and explain to the judge that HB refused to serve my TRO. And not only that, they refused to serve it, but they stood there, and while this man hired teenagers from across the street to dismantle my garage frame door and take everything with them, strip my battery from my moped, and they were standing there. I made the report. I told they were there. They knew what happened. I get told that, I need to have them come in and photograph the crime scene 5 days later. These are issues that we're dealing with here. We call, we have restrictions put on how they will answer us if they decide to answer us, and then we do what we're told to do. We get TROs, and then we get denied the judicial protection. So there's a lot of issues going on here that people don't want to talk about. There's so many cases that I have right here. I've contacted lawyer after lawyer after lawyer. Nobody will touch it because nobody wants to talk about HB.
Thank you for sharing your story, and so sorry for everything that you and others have experienced. We're actually litigating a case right now that has a similar fact pattern in the sense of misclassifying the kind of alleged crime from a 911 call. So our client had called 911, and I need to be careful about what I say about this active case. We're actually on appeal before the Ninth Circuit. But our client, the case alleges that our client was in a dispute with her boss at her home. Her boss tried to break into her home. She called 911, saying that she was being attacked. And this, by the way, is one of the conflict of interest cases that we're working on. She calls 911. The lead officer who responded to the scene is a close friend and business partner of the boss. And basically, no police report was filed on behalf of our clients about her allegations about the theft and the assaults. I'm sorry, not the theft, the assaults. Meanwhile, our client, we allege, was framed for committing theft because at the time she had in her possession a business phone for the business. So we're litigating this right now. This is a serious problem across many jurisdictions about failing to document what people are, because from our perspective and from a lot of people's perspective, right? The police report is, and a court has said this, is the gateway to the criminal legal system, right? If a police report is not filed, prosecutors can't really do anything, right? And so the fact that there are officers who are refusing to take police reports, we believe that is a First Amendment petition issue, right? You have a right to petition for redress of grievances, and the police report is a critical document for that process.
I would like to discuss the police reports as well. So officers that I have dealt with, and almost every time I have dealt with them here in Honolulu, seem to think that it is okay to tell you what to write in your report. I had to ask officers multiple times if I was allowed to write my report because I got assaulted after the men assaulted my friend that I was there with, that I was reporting. After they assaulted her, they were showing her, officers were showing her, let him go free, came and assaulted me. They wouldn't make any charges on everything that happened during those on video. They wouldn't they took my assault down to harassment, and then it just disappeared completely. The report issue was a big issue to me. There was multiple witnesses around the Honolulu Tennis Union, all there witnessing for us as this was happening, and they were all there as the police officers told us multiple times. They tried to make me write that I wasn't injured, and they never called me mess. Like, I needed to get checked, I fractured elbow, actually. So, like, there were so many things that they tried to tell us word for word, what to write in the report, and nobody else was fighting back. Now, I've only been on the island for a year, okay? So for me to come here and see some of these behaviors, and I've been in an advocacy role in my past, and I was a paralegal at one time, so I'm over here like, what is going on? I can't believe that these things are being done so blatantly. Just 2 days ago, in the same building that I'm talking about, 24 police officers stormed the building, no notice. They went into people's personal homes. There was a lady that is disabled in a wheelchair. She was laying naked in her bed. They would not leave her home to even allow her to get dressed. And they came with inspectors. No notice. Nobody knew what was happening. But it's been completely, it's one building. These are tenants. They actually have leases. Nobody's stopping to ask those types of questions. That's the issue. They're not asking questions when there's violent crime there. They're literally telling these people they're on their own. We don't have to act. So, and that's literally coming out of their mouths. They don't have to do anything. Okay, I understand that, but also there's times where them being there emboldened the people to do what they were doing. And that's what we're still dealing with. And nobody will touch it. So we're actually getting ready to file on our own. Like, this is a lot. And no lawyers want to touch it. We had 2 state representatives stand up and speak at the actual press conference with myself the night before the attack happened. And the HPD was present. They were there. Two different state representatives spoke out against this. And they told them they need to lean in a little closer. They won't. So the thing that worries me is I found out from what I can gather that HPD is the only referring source to the prosecutor's office. Is that correct here?
I mean, I think that practically speaking, right, and this is to my point about police reports being the gateway to the criminal legal system, absent a police report, it's really hard to, so it's not technically the only way, but
I had contact with the prosecutor's office, and they let me know that they knew nothing about any of the complaints, the multiple police reports of complaints that these parents put in. So, I guess if HPD doesn't put it through, it doesn't make it to the prosecutor. That's what I'm being told, at least.
I think in large part that's probably true, right? And that's why it's so important that police reports are taken by police officers, because from our perspective, it's the same way as if you go and hand carry your lawsuit, your complaint to initiate your lawsuit to the courthouse and deliver it to the clerk's office. They don't have a right to refuse it. They have to accept it. The same thing goes for police reports in our view, and we're litigating this very issue right now because we think it's absolutely critical and part of each and every one of our First Amendment rights.
The issue is also, once you do actually make that police report online, they put all of the burden of the evidence on the victim of the crime. All of them.
Hi there. So a really good point about once you have the police report is if it actually gets into the system within the prosecutor's office. And so I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. Like, even though the police may have said, oh, it's referred to the prosecutor's office, it's out of our hands, we can no longer investigate, it's stuck at the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor says it's under investigation, but we can't see the investigation, there's like a stuck point there. And so I guess my question is are we able to bring that police report that we're trusting HPD to actually process to the prosecutor's office, to go down to the actual prosecutor's office to make sure, is this on file? Because I've had a similar situation where 2 months later, it was never in the prosecutor's hands, even though they said that it was under investigation. So I guess my question is like, how do you hold accountable the shuffling of like the bureaucratic process of paperwork? Because one says one thing, the other says the other thing, and then there's no, I guess, like safeguard or watchdog to say like, was that paperwork actually processed and input into the system? And then I see there's a gap in the timeline where enforcement can happen and misrepresentation can happen, and there's that stuck point of the lag of paperwork and no accountability. So I guess, I don't know if that's a question, but like, I need some clarity on the actual like bureaucratic process because I see a lot of purpose.
The reality here too, and this goes to the transparency point, is that a lot of what happens at HPD is a black box. The same goes for the prosecutor's office. So that's one point. The second point is that there's a very big difference between what HPD policies say about what is happening and what is actually happening in reality. So to your point, right, and I don't quote me on this, but every police report that has list, right, there are different categories of offenses and whatnot, but based on the offense that's listed in the police report, my understanding is that they're automatically supposed to be forwarded to the prosecutor's office and then investigated to the extent required. But there's no insight into whether that's actually happening and what percentage. We're encountering this problem right now in our class action against HPD around DUI arrests because based on the limited data that we had before we filed the lawsuit, and I need to be careful about what I say, so let me think. But the point is, what we observed with the public records we were able to obtain before filing our lawsuit was that there are a lot of people who were blowing zeros at the station, yet had been arrested for driving under the influence. And what was the eventual prosecution rate, conviction rate, etc.? It was close to zero, right? Very few cases were even being charged. And then of those very few cases being charged, almost none led to a conviction, right? Yet we see all these numbers every week, or not every week, but we see numbers about HPD made, X number of DUI arrests last night. All of this to say, there's a lot of opacity in what is happening after you as a citizen report a crime. I'm sorry, that's all I know because it's a black box.
Hello. Aloha. Thank you for being here. Nikos Leverins with Drug Policy Forum of Hawaii and Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. And we work with many people who are impacted by behavioral health issues and poverty as well, and sheltered homelessness. It's nice to have you from the continent. And while I was born and raised here, I came of political and professional age in California, where I was in Sacramento for a while. And when I moved back, so much of what you all said today, I've kind of observed just firsthand. In fact, I could probably go through my advocacy letters and talk about just how barren Hawaii is on so many levels in terms of processes. For example, recently we have three pilot project school resource officers being placed in the schools. I have seen nothing in the media, nothing from our elected officials. We have the chair of the Public Safety Committee of the House here talking about whether or not this is the judicious thing to do, whether or not what their rules of engagement are, whether or not, this is a judicious use of resources, not just whether it's right in the abstract, because many of our schools do not have adequate facilities. They certainly don't have adequate access to counseling and other violence prevention efforts. We also have this panopticon, this electronic panopticon that's being developed. When Mandy was here last time as policy director, there was actually a bill that then Judiciary Chair Chris Lee introduced that would have sought some level of statewide regulation regarding the collection, retention, use, dissemination, and disposal of electronic surveillance. And now we're in a situation where we're putting up stoplight cameras, license plate reader cameras, facial recognition cameras, and there is zero input from our elected officials, much less the public. So they have been derelict in their duty, in my view, in being advocates for the public, who, quite frankly, people here in Hawaii, like so many other people, they're busy working their jobs, raising their kids. But it's the under-resourced communities who are disproportionately impacted. So, my question is, I also think we need an inspector general to be able to continually look at the operation of law enforcement in this state amongst other departments and to provide recommendations. So what are some of the core recommendations that you would offer in terms of, and I think you've touched on this, but I want to see legislation, I want to see policy change. And also, could you maybe address how a proactive prosecutor can actually be a benefit with or without legislative input? And is anybody from the prosecutor's office here? Of course.
I'm happy to answer the latter question. We've seen progressive prosecutors' offices sometimes unilaterally introduce really, really important reforms, some of the ones I'm talking about, when there is not the legislative appetite or there's legislative cowardice on an issue. Two things come to mind. I know that there's a couple prosecutors' offices now across the country that say, we are not going to prosecute a case if you give us an AI-generated police report. That does not require a law, right? So to the extent, you have any, input, to the extent there's an elected prosecutor or you live in a community where you could speak to the appointing authority about who's appointed, ask them what their position on issues like that is and push for someone who is more progressive on issues like that. Another example, Kelly and I actually spoke with a prosecutor in Burlington, Vermont, and the greater Burlington area, who said, look, if you come to me with evidence of drugs or guns, police, you want to charge someone with a crime, but the way you uncovered them was stopping them for some sort of minor traffic violation, the sort of thing that generates these big racial disparities, I'm not going to prosecute that, right? Ideally, that's passed through legislation, but when that legislation is not passed, we need to put pressure on other actors, including prosecutors, including the Attorney General's office, who can take actions to mitigate these immense harms.
Yeah, I'll add an additional thought on some things prosecutors can do. We know that there are officers who are problems to put on the stand, right? Like they have a history of going on the stand and having been untruthful or having misconduct allegations, and prosecutors' offices can do a lot more to be really clear about what officers those are, because that has trickle-down effects into the police department. It doesn't even have to necessarily be a big public splash, but if a prosecutor cannot put a police officer on the stand, that is a very ineffective police officer, and it causes change at the police agency level. So I'll add that as an additional thing that prosecutors should have a position on. I love the Inspector General idea. That's something we certainly advocate for. So this is sort of an independent state level body that has the ability to audit and look at bad practices. We think about at the federal level, under a different administration, the Department of Justice has the ability to go in and say, these law enforcement agencies have a pattern or practice of engaging in racial disparities or violations of people's civil rights, and the federal government comes in and imposes penalties and incentives to not do that. They get court orders saying that law enforcement agencies can't do that. And state governments can empower agencies to do that too. I live in Minneapolis, and we are under a state level consent decree, which is very helpful because the Trump administration wouldn't sign the federal consent decree. So we're under a state consent decree that says Minneapolis Police Department is a wretched police department and needs to do a lot better in a lot of areas. And they have the ability to really hold the department accountable. And that is absolutely something Hawaii can do. Unfortunately, it is not a change that happens tomorrow, but I think it is a very, very worthwhile one. Wookie, anything to add?
I don't really have anything to add other than, right, prosecutors do have a lot of discretion, but that also means, right, they can decide to adopt internal policies that are, you know, protecting the public.
I think, unfortunately, that is the end of our time tonight. We have up here contact information. I can only speak for myself on this, but I welcome you to reach out. We would love to chat further. And I think on behalf of all of us, I would love to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. These are, thank you. These are incredibly important conversations, and nobody can do more than you all as members of the public. So thank you so much.